All right, well, we're joined again by Marina Lowe, the Legislative and Policy Counsel at the ACLU of Utah, for our second episode of ACLU on the Hill. Marina, can you tell us about some of the legislation that the ACLU has been working on this week?
Yeah, it's been a fast-paced session. Last week was very busy with lots of bills being introduced and heard, and this week is no exception. A lot of really exciting pieces of legislation, some that we like and some we don't like quite as much.
Can you tell us about some bills that the ACLU testified by, are there for or against this week?
Yeah, so the first bill that I'd like to share with you all has to do with the death penalty. There was a bill introduced in the Senate. Senator Maine introduced a bill to expand upon the aggravating factors, which are the things that prosecutors need to consider before they can charge a crime as a capital case, as a case that would be subject to the death penalty. And so what Senator Maine wants to do in her bill is to expand the categories of crimes for which the death penalty is available, and this would include first responders when they are killed intentionally by somebody that would qualify instantly for the death penalty.
This is an expansion on a bill that passed in a previous session, is that right?
Well, it's just expanding upon our existing code section that deals with aggravating factors. The ACLU's concern is twofold, really, about this type of legislation. One, because we have grave concerns with the death penalty for a host of different reasons, both legal and ethical and moral reasons, fiscal reasons, we just don't believe that we should be continuing to expand the categories of people for whom the death penalty is available. But from a more legal perspective, there's also a real concern that the idea behind the death penalty being constitutional is that it's reserved really for the very worst of the worst types of crimes that are committed. And if we continue to expand to our aggravating factors statute and adding, this type of situation and that type of situation qualify you for the death penalty, we're going to be arriving at a point, and perhaps we are already there, where there is virtually no murder that could be committed in the state of Utah that would not qualify you for the death penalty. And at that point, we really rub up against this question of whether our statute is constitutional any longer, whether it's truly still reserved just for the worst of the worst, or whether it's open to anybody who commits a murder in the state of Utah.
Got it. Thanks for explaining that. Now, the viral video of the summer was, of course, Nurse Alex Wubbles at the University of, LDS Hospital, I believe. Now, that has led to some legislation this year. Can you tell us about that legislation about blood draws?
Yeah, there was a lot of cameras flashing yesterday. Nurse Wubbles actually came to the committee herself and spoke in a Senate committee hearing on behalf of a bill being brought by Representative Craig Hall, which makes abundantly clear that if law enforcement is going to take a blood draw, they need to get a warrant. Either get a warrant or make sure that they have somebody's consent. This is a really common sense piece of legislation. The committee that heard this bill yesterday regularly signs off on measures requiring warrants for all sorts of things. Your cell phone data, your driver's license, your license plate information. It seems very clear that the blood running through your body should also be subject to those very same warrant requirements.
Is it likely that this bill will pass the legislature this year?
Oh, absolutely. It's flying through. It's already been approved by the House. This was its first Senate hearing. It now moves on to the entire Senate. I think it's had unanimous votes so far. I would expect that should continue on the Senate floor.
Can you tell us about some of the legislation related to automatic voter registration that the ACLU is working on?
Yeah, so there are a lot of voting bills this year, and one of the issues that the ACLU is most excited to promote this year has to do with this notion of automatic voter registration. And really what this bill does is, right now when you go to the driver's license department and you go to update or get a new driver's license, you already have the option on the form that you fill out to check a box saying, please register me to vote. What this bill would do is just sort of change that default, and you'd actually check the box if you didn't want to be registered to vote. So it makes it easier from an administrative standpoint for elections officials to get accurate and clean voter rolls, and it also makes it better for voters. It means more people are automatically registered when they show up on election day. If they went and got their driver's license, it turns out that they're already registered, and just makes it a little bit easier for them to participate.
And I remember reading that it would be several 100,000 people that could have been registered right now if this bill had been in place over the past couple of years.
That's absolutely right. And the experience of other states that have already implemented this same sort of system have seen their voter rolls swell.
And there would be protections to make sure that people who are not eligible to vote could not register, is that right?
That's absolutely right. The bill does take into account that concern.
Now, a lot of attention has been focused on HB 205, an abortion ban for fetuses with Down syndrome, but there's another abortion bill out there. Can you tell us about that bill?
Yeah, so the bill that was heard yesterday in the Senate committee is being sponsored by Senator Weiler. And in large part what the bill will do is sort of update the information that is provided to a woman that she needs to view under state law before she can go ahead and get an abortion. There were some technical changes that needed to be made to make sure that the viewing of this information didn't place an undue burden on a woman who is seeking an abortion. That language was modified slightly, and so we think for the most part this bill just sort of updates the information and doesn't create any new hurdles for a woman seeking an abortion in our state.
So sometimes there are bills that are like that. They're changing terms, definitions, kind of cleanup bills. And this bill sort of fits that role, more or less.
As amended, I think it does.
Okay. Any other legislation that's coming up that you'd want to put on our radar for next week or beyond?
There are a lot of other issues coming, so definitely stay tuned. There's a lot of exciting legislation that's just been numbered this week having to do with gender equity in the workplace. Things like modifying our anti-discrimination statute, credits for employers who want to provide their employees with paid family leave. So a lot of really exciting measures to keep your eye on.
All right, well, stay tuned and check back in next week. Thank you, Marina Lowe, for joining us on ACLU on the Hill.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Connor, I'd like to introduce you to our audience. This is Connor Boyack, who is the president of the Libertas Institute, which is a libertarian-leaning think tank.
Yep.
Connor partners with the ACLU on a variety of issues, oftentimes dealing with things around criminal justice, privacy, and technology. Thanks so much for joining us on this cold day outside.
Thanks for having me. It is cold. We'll suffer through it.
So I wanted to just share a little bit with some of our viewers about a bill that you and I have worked on for a number of years now.
Yeah.
The bill deals with forcible entry. Do you want to give a little bit of background about how we sort of got into this area?
So I think the event that launched it into statewide prominence was the Matthew David Stewart incident up in Ogden. This was several years ago when officers were serving a nighttime warrant. They called it a knock and announce warrant, but neighbors felt like it was a knock and then immediately announced, so it was really just a no-knock warrant. Nonetheless, it was chaos. The officers were just wearing plain clothes. One had a Cheech and Chong t-shirt. They come in, guns blazing. Matthew starts firing back, thinks that he's being invaded. Apparently, mass firefight ensues. 5 officers were injured. 1 was killed. Matthew himself was wounded and later committed suicide in jail. Just a massive mess. And so I think for both of our organizations, that was the signal to kind of say, hey, we need to look at maybe addressing some of the policy and see what happened.
And if I'm not wrong about this, the reason that they went in this very violent manner was simply because he was in possession of drugs.
He was growing some marijuana plants to self-medicate for PTSD. He was a veteran. His ex-girlfriend ratted him out, and so officers came in, guns a-blazing.
That's right. So Connor and I were both very concerned about this situation. There was sort of a lot of national concern around the idea of forcible entry, a really high-profile case in Georgia. Do you remember that one as well, where officers went in with a flashbang grenade?
The crib.
Yes, which landed in the crib of a baby and seriously injured that child. So just a lot of outrage around the country around this tactic that makes things more dangerous both for officers and for those upon whom a warrant is being served.
And I think it's important to point that out. When we first started, I think the conversation was very much about the victim or the resident, but we position this, I think, fairly and correctly, that this is as much about making sure that officers aren't unnecessarily having to risk their own lives. Like, guys, if this is just about a marijuana plant, we don't want to send you into a circumstance where someone might jeopardize your life. And so it's very much a two-sided thing.
Right. So we decided to do something at the legislature. I think it was 3 or 4 years now, with Representative Mark Roberts.
Yep.
Do you want to share what we did in that initial bill?
I've been talking a lot. How about you share?
Okay. So we did put in, well, we actually proposed some of the very same changes that we're proposing again this year, to have some sort of requirements around what needs to go into the affidavit that a judge has to consider when they're signing off on these warrants, making sure that the proper investigation has been done, that they've figured out that it is indeed the right home that they're going to serve this warrant at, that they've justified why they need to go in the middle of the night, why they need to do this in a no-knock manner. We've heard situations here in Utah where officers routinely go to the wrong house.
Yep.
So really important to make sure that this sort of investigation is being done. We got a lot of pushback on that particular piece.
For sure.
But did make some headway on some of the other portions of the bill that we were pushing. We had to follow up the next year with a different legislator, Senator Urquhart.
Yeah, you want me to jump in there? So
Please do.
That was good follow-up, because really we came out swinging, I think, 4 years ago and bit off a little more than anyone wanted to chew. And so we scaled that bill back, but it really started several years of policy making and conversation. And so Senator Urquhart, the next year, following up with what was Senate Bill 82, so 3 years ago. And that bill did a number of other things we were able to get done. There was policies about body cameras that officers would have to wear. We said that you had to have identifying marks that you were police so that the resident didn't think that you were, a gang member.
Which is important in Utah because a lot of people have guns
for sure
in their homes for self-defense. And so if somebody walks in wearing a Cheech and Chong shirt,
right,
one could reasonably suspect that they were an intruder.
Unfortunately, it's not enough because we've seen incidents in the past few years where home intruders are dressed as police, right? And so that's not necessarily an end-all be-all. But one of the most important things that Senator Urquhart got done in that bill, I think, was something that we had to advocate pretty strongly for, and that is to make sure that if all we're talking about is just the possession of a controlled substance, that as a policy we want to say that is not something we want to have a forcible entry for at all. Even if the person might be violent, if all we're talking about is the guy is smoking marijuana at home or something like that, just leave him alone, figure it out some other way.
Which leads us to the bill this year. One of the, I think, most important pieces of the legislation being proposed by Mark Roberts this year in HB 83 deals with going beyond just the mere possession as the basis or the non-basis for executing a forcible entry warrant. And the reason for this, we've discovered, is that oftentimes the quantity of drugs that are possessed is what can allow a prosecutor to charge something more than just possession, but also possession with the intent to distribute.
Yeah, it's very subjective, right? Because if I have a lot of marijuana, maybe I'm a medical user and I go to Colorado and I want to have a 2-month supply because I don't want to have to make weekend trips. Yes, that's technically illegal. We're working on that. If you haven't signed the ballot initiative, then go to utahpatients.org. Quick little plug. But absent that reform, that's illegal, right? And if I have a large supply of marijuana, an officer can right now, even with our law that Senator Urquhart got put in place that you can't do it for possession, an officer could articulate to a judge that that's possession with the intent to distribute, because no one would have that much. Clearly he's going to distribute, and that really undermines the intent of what the legislature already did. I think we're trying to position this year's bill, House Bill 83, as honoring the existing legislative intent and making sure that officers can't do that.
Right. And the final piece of the bill, of course, is putting back in this requirement that judges really take a close look when they're signing off on these forcible entry warrants. Some of the things we mentioned at the outset, making sure that proper investigation has been done, that they're justifying why they need to use this amount of force and why they need to go in during nighttime hours.
And I think probably going forward, you'll see both of our organizations engaged on that judicial piece a little more, because the Salt Lake Tribune did an investigative piece just a few weeks ago showing that these warrants are being very quickly issued electronically. And so I think we're jointly concerned that the judges maybe aren't sufficiently reviewing these very serious requests for law enforcement activity. And so we'll see what comes out of that, but I imagine this is still the continuing of a long conversation.
But the beginning. So definitely stay tuned. The bill number is HB 83. It's being sponsored by Representative Mark Roberts. And we're excited to get it into a committee and get the hearing underway, and look forward to more partnership between Libertas Institute and ACLU on other criminal justice issues.